in Acts chapter, we'll be in Acts chapter 8. And we've been, I don't know, kind of sort of studying a chapter at a time. I don't know if we'll get through this whole chapter tonight. There's a lot here, a lot to cover, a lot to see, a lot to read. It's not as long as the last chapter, of course. We got through it in one service, but there's 2 or 3 different stories, if you will, I guess, here. Actually, there's 4 different stories in this chapter, and a little bit to say about each one of them, and then we're going to talk about each one of them as we read. First thing we want to notice, we're in Acts chapter 8, verse 1. Let's go ahead and read verse 1. And Saul was consenting unto his death, and at that time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. The first sentence in this chapter, in this first verse, and Saul was consenting unto his death. This is a continuation of the last chapter. We read in the last chapter of Stephen the sermon that he preached, and then his stoning to death, and Saul, who would later become Paul, was a young man at the time. Verse 58 and verse 7 says, and cast him out of the city and stoned him, and the witnesses laid down their clothes at a young man's feet whose name was Saul. So the man who would become the Apostle Paul was there at the stoning of Stephen and witnessed that, and it looks as though had some participation in it. Not actually a stoning, but he at least watched over the clothes of the men who did the stoning. And so, for whatever reason, I'm not sure how and who determined how they broke these chapters and verses up, but for some reason we see Saul mentioned in the first sentence in verse 1 of chapter 8. And it's just a brief mention. It just says, and Saul was consenting unto his death. We will see some more, well, in the next few verses we see some more about Saul. So I guess really the first 4 verses of this chapter could be a continuation of the last chapter, but in particular verse 1. And notice it says that at that time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem. Remember the church at Jerusalem, the first church there, had grown immensely since the day of Pentecost. They had gained somewhere around 3,000 members. When Peter preached on the day of Pentecost, there had been a few thousand more added since then. Some theologians will claim that there was somewhere between 20 and 30,000 Jews that were members of the first church by this time. We don't know. I don't know how they figure that. I've looked at it myself, and you can kind of guess, but the scripture doesn't tell us exactly. There are places where it tells us that there were some added to the church, and it doesn't give us a number. Most of the places it does give us a number. There was 3,000 or around 3,000 on the day of Pentecost, but it only mentions men there. It doesn't mention, and we know they had their families there because they had traveled from afar, and we see that mentioned in other places where those men had their families with them. So we don't know if it was just the men, or was it men and women and children that were saved? It just says the men. We don't know. But there was at least 3,000 men saved that day. There was another time when there was over 5,000 that were saved. And so it's just a guess at how many were in the first church by the time you get to chapter 8. The Lord doesn't tell us, and personally, my personal thought on that is that it's not anything to be concerned about. We know it was a great number. That's good enough. I think one of the things we're taught as Baptists is that numbers don't matter. And I believe that's what the Scripture tells us. It's not the numbers that matter. So there was great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem. The chief priest and the priest under him at the temple were sending out men to persecute these people. They considered the people of the church heretics. They considered them hypocrites and heretics. They considered what they were teaching and preaching as blasphemy, because they were preaching Jesus Christ and they weren't preaching the law. The part of the law they were teaching was what Jesus fulfilled, and that's how they were preaching.